The archive lockdown started at exactly 1:14 a.m. during the storm. Every hallway door inside sublevel C slammed shut simultaneously hard enough to shake dust from the concrete ceiling above me, while the emergency lights shifted from white to deep pulsing red. I remember standing alone beside Security Checkpoint 4, staring at the surveillance monitors as static swallowed half the camera feeds underground. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains above the facility while rain hammered the ventilation shafts hidden somewhere far overhead. Then the intercom crackled softly beside the checkpoint desk. "Officer Hale," a woman whispered through heavy static. "Do not open Corridor 9. My stomach tightened instantly because I recognized the voice immediately. Evelyn Ross, the archivist who disappeared inside the restricted wing 7 years earlier. Before I could answer, one of the security cameras flickered back online. Corridor 9. At first, the hallway looked empty beneath the emergency lights. Endless concrete walls lined with sealed archive doors stretching into darkness underground. Then the camera slowly adjusted focus toward the far end of the corridor. Someone was standing there motionless near the sealed blast door. Dark government security uniform. Rainwater dripped from their sleeves despite the corridor being 3 levels underground. The figure slowly raised its head toward the camera. It was wearing my face. Then the storm sirens activated throughout the archive, and somewhere behind the locked doors beneath sublevel C, something began knocking slowly from inside the walls. 3 nights earlier. I took the archive security contract because I needed somewhere quiet enough to disappear for a while. After 14 years working private security for federal transport companies, I developed the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep so much as years spent watching people hide things from each other professionally. My name is Nathan Hale, 38 years old. Former military police officer, divorced, and recently suspended from my previous job after an incident involving excessive force during a courthouse evacuation outside Baltimore. Officially, nobody blamed me directly for what happened. Unofficially, everyone involved understood I needed time away from public-facing assignments before lawyers and internal investigators finished sorting through the aftermath. So when a contractor offered me a temporary overnight position guarding a remote underground government archive buried somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, I accepted almost immediately without asking many questions. The pay was excellent. Minimal staff interaction. Rotating night shifts 6 days a week. At the time, isolation sounded preferable to explaining myself to anyone anymore. The facility itself sat hidden beneath an abandoned weather monitoring station deep inside the mountains of Western Virginia. From the surface, the place looked insignificant enough to overlook completely, a fenced concrete structure surrounded by communication towers, backup generators, and dense forest stretching endlessly through the rain-soaked hills around it. But 2 elevator levels beneath the surface, the archive became something else entirely. Miles of reinforced underground corridors extended beneath the mountain, connected through blast doors, biometric checkpoints, and endless climate-controlled storage wings, humming softly with machinery at all hours. Most of the archived material remained classified beyond my clearance level. Government records. Cold War intelligence. Sealed evidence repositories. Entire sections accessible only to senior archivists and federal oversight teams. The deeper levels especially felt less like an archive and more like something built to survive catastrophe. Thick concrete walls. Independent power systems. Airlock corridors separate the sublevels from each other like compartments inside a submarine buried underground. My supervisor during orientation was a man named Richard Voss. Mid-50s maybe. Thin, exhausted-looking, with the habit of pausing slightly too long before answering direct questions. He walked me through the security procedures first. Patrol rotations. Access clearance systems. Emergency lockdown protocols during severe weather events. Most of the overnight work involved monitoring restricted corridors and responding to system alerts triggered by pressure fluctuations or maintenance errors throughout the archive levels. Simple enough. Then, near the end of the briefing, Voss handed me a separate binder labeled Storm Rotation Procedures. The instructions inside looked far less official than the standard archive documentation surrounding it. Never enter Corridor 9 during active thunderstorms. If personnel appear on surveillance cameras inside sealed wings, verify badge records before making contact. Do not respond to voices coming through disconnected intercom systems. During storm lockouts, certain hallways may display incorrect floor layouts. And the final rule, typed in larger lettering across the last page. If you encounter someone claiming to work in sublevel C after 1 a.m., ask them which year they believe it is before continuing the conversation. I remember asking Voss directly whether the rules were some kind of psychological stress test for new guards. He stared at me for several seconds before glancing toward the security monitors overlooking sublevel C. Most federal facilities buried this deep-developed strange stories eventually, he said quietly. People spend enough years underground around classified material, and they start creating explanations for things they don't fully understand. The answer sounded rehearsed somehow, like something repeated too many times already. Then his expression shifted slightly while he tapped one specific corridor highlighted on the archive map spread across the checkpoint desk. Corridor 9. Restricted access wing sealed behind reinforced blast doors at the far end of sublevel C. According to the map, the section connected to older archive tunnels was abandoned decades earlier during expansion work beneath the mountain. Storm pressure affects the lower systems sometimes, Voss added carefully. If the lockdown activates, stay clear of 9 until morning shift arrives. Before ending the orientation, Voss showed me the emergency override controls capable of sealing entire archive wings during system breaches. Then, almost casually, he mentioned Evelyn Ross while reviewing old incident logs. Senior archivist. Missing for 7 years after failing to report back from a document retrieval assignment inside Corridor 9 during a severe thunderstorm. Officially, the investigation blamed structural disorientation caused by emergency lighting failures during a lockdown event. Unofficially, nobody ever recovered a body. People get turned around underground easier than they realize, Voss said quietly while shutting off the archive monitors for the night shift transition. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far above the mountain while the ventilation systems hummed softly through the concrete halls surrounding us. Then the lights inside sublevel C flickered once, briefly plunging the checkpoint into darkness before stabilizing again. And for a split second during that blackout, I could have sworn someone was standing motionless at the far end of Corridor 9 watching us from beyond the sealed blast door. The first few nights inside the archive almost convinced me the storm procedures were nothing more than exaggerated institutional folklore developed by people who spent too much time underground. Federal facilities attract superstition naturally, especially those built beneath mountains where entire shifts pass without seeing daylight once. The archive itself operated with almost mechanical predictability during normal conditions. My overnight routine settled quickly after orientation. Around 8 p.m., I'd run security sweeps through sublevels A through C, checking access points, pressure doors, and environmental systems while archivists finished their final retrieval work for the evening. By midnight, most personnel had already left the lower wings entirely. After that, the archive became unnaturally quiet except for the constant low hum of ventilation systems moving through the concrete corridors around me. Some nights, the silence underground felt so complete I could hear electrical currents buzzing softly inside the fluorescent lights overhead. Sublevel C especially carried a strange atmosphere after midnight. The deeper archive wings stretched endlessly through reinforced corridors lined with sealed document vaults and climate-controlled storage rooms buried beneath hundreds of feet of mountain stone. Motion sensor lights activated slowly ahead of you while the sections behind faded back into darkness almost immediately, creating the constant feeling that the archive itself was swallowing the hallways behind each patrol route. I understood why old employees might eventually develop strange stories about the place. Underground architecture affects perception over time. Identical corridors. Artificial lighting. No sense of weather or time except distant thunder vibrating faintly through the ventilation shafts during storms above ground. Still, nothing openly disturbing happened during those first shifts. The surveillance systems worked normally. Access logs matched personnel movements. Corridor 9 remained sealed behind inactive blast doors exactly the way the maps described. The first strange incident happened during my fourth night while a thunderstorm moved across the mountains above the facility. Around 12:43 a.m., one of the archive cameras inside sublevel C briefly displayed movement near Corridor 9 despite the entire wing remaining locked under restricted clearance status. At first, I assumed another guard had entered the area without updating the patrol logs. The figure on screen stood motionless beneath the fluorescent lights near the sealed blast door, or was wearing an archive staff uniform partially obscured by static distortion. But something about the footage felt wrong immediately. The hallway lights surrounding the figure flickered slightly out of sync with the rest of the corridor, almost like the camera was capturing two separate recordings layered together imperfectly. Then the checkpoint intercom crackled softly beside me. Sublevel pressure variant stable. A woman whispered through heavy static. Do not open the corridor during atmospheric events. Before I could answer, the transmission cut off completely. I checked the badge logs afterward, mostly to reassure myself. No unauthorized personnel had entered sublevel C all night. No active credentials registered near Corridor 9 during the camera disturbance. Still explainable. Security systems malfunction constantly during storms in older underground facilities where pressure fluctuations interfere with electronics. But smaller things started accumulating after that night. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps echoing faintly through sealed corridors despite motion sensors remaining inactive. Twice, I found archive doors standing partially open during patrols, even though the electronic logs showed no recent access activity. One morning, the emergency lockdown siren activated briefly at exactly 1:14 a.m. before shutting itself off again without any recorded system breach. The worst part wasn't the events themselves. It was how ordinary everyone upstairs acted whenever I mentioned them. Strange behavior during storms was simply something accepted underground after enough years working there. On my sixth night, I accidentally broke the first rule without realizing it. Severe thunderstorms rolled across the mountains shortly after midnight, causing intermittent pressure alerts throughout sublevel C. Around 1:03 a.m., one of the environmental monitors near Corridor 9 displayed a containment seal fault requiring manual inspection from the lower checkpoint hallway. The process took less than 10 minutes. I grabbed my flashlight and access card without even thinking about the storm procedures. The deeper I moved into sublevel C, the quieter the archive became. Motion lights activated slowly ahead of me through the endless concrete corridors while thunder rolled faintly somewhere above the mountain. Halfway toward Corridor 9, the intercom mounted beside the hallway ceiling crackled suddenly through static. "Officer Hale," Evelyn Ross whispered. "You shouldn't be down here during electrical activity." Every muscle in my body locked instantly because the voice sounded perfect. Human. Tired in the exact way people sound near the end of long overnight shifts. Then the hallway lights flickered once, and for a brief second, the corridor ahead of me appeared much longer than it should have been. long enough that I couldn't see the blast door at the far end anymore. Only darkness stretches deeper underground beneath the humming fluorescent lights. The hallway returned to normal almost immediately after the lights stabilized. Corridor 9 sat exactly where it should have been at the far end of sublevel C beneath the emergency exit signage, sealed behind the same reinforced blast door shown on every archive map in the facility. I remember standing motionless in the middle of the corridor while fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead and thunder vibrated faintly through the ventilation shafts somewhere above the mountain. Rationally, I understood what probably happened. Temporary lighting failure combined with exhaustion and poor depth perception underground. The archive corridors were already unnerving enough during storms without my imagination helping. Still explainable. Still manageable. But the intercom transmission bothered me more than the visual distortion because Evelyn Ross's voice hadn't sounded distorted beneath the static. It sounded immediate. Like someone speaking quietly from another hallway nearby instead of through a disconnected archive system. I should have turned around after that. Instead, I kept walking toward Corridor 9 mostly because embarrassment outweighed caution at the time. I'd spent years working security in federal transport facilities and military compounds. The idea that I was becoming unsettled by old underground corridors and missing person stories during a thunderstorm felt ridiculous, even while every instinct kept telling me to leave the lower wing immediately. The pressure fault itself turned out to be minor. One of the environmental seal indicators near the blast door was showing intermittent errors because of storm interference in the electrical systems. I ran a manual systems check beside the checkpoint console while fluorescent lights flickered softly above the corridor. For a while, everything felt normal again. Mechanical. Explainable. Then I noticed something strange on the wall opposite the blast door. A security mirror mounted near the ceiling reflected the corridor behind me correctly, except for one detail. My reflection wasn't facing the same direction I was. At first, I thought it was just the angle. Then the reflection slowly turned its head toward me. Not delayed. Independent. Every muscle in my body locked instantly while cold pressure settled behind my ribs hard enough to make breathing difficult. The reflection inside the mirror wore my security uniform exactly. Same posture. Same flashlight clipped to the shoulder harness. But the expression felt subtly wrong somehow. Too calm. Too aware. I backed away from the mirror instinctively, and the reflection continued watching me for another second before finally mimicking the movement a moment later. Then the corridor lights flickered again. During the brief darkness, I heard footsteps somewhere beyond the sealed blast door beneath Corridor 9. Slow measured impacticong through concrete tunnels deeper underground. Not random movement. Someone is walking steadily toward the checkpoint from inside the restricted wing. The emergency intercom crackled softly moments later. "Officer Hale," Evelyn whispered through static. "Do not let them know you recognize the layout changes." My stomach tightened instantly because the sentence made absolutely no sense. Before I could respond, the blast door status panel beside me shifted from locked to access pending without any card authorization. A low mechanical groan echoed through the corridor as the reinforced seals around Corridor 9 disengaged slightly beneath the storm pressure fluctuations. The door itself opened less than an inch before stopping automatically. Just enough space for cold air to drift slowly into sublevel C from whatever existed beyond the archive wing. The temperature difference felt impossible. The air coming through the opening smelled like wet concrete and rain despite the corridor being buried hundreds of feet underground. And beneath the humming fluorescent lights, I could hear distant thunder echoing softly from somewhere deep behind the partially opened blast door. That's when I made the mistake that changed everything afterward. I looked through the opening. The corridor beyond 9 didn't resemble the archive maps at all. Instead of another reinforced government storage wing, an entirely different hallway stretched beyond the blast door into darkness underground. Old concrete tunnels lined with rusted pipes and water stains were disappearing beneath dim emergency lights that looked decades older than the rest of the facility. The architecture felt wrong immediately. Older. Deeper. Like part of the mountain itself had been hollowed out long before the archive existed above it. Then I noticed movement farther down the corridor. Someone was standing motionless beneath the emergency lights, watching me through the partially opened blast door. The government security uniform was soaked with rainwater, face hidden in shadow. But even from that distance, I recognized the posture instantly because the figure was standing the same way I did when checking surveillance monitors back at the checkpoint desk. Then the lights flickered again, and the thing inside Corridor 9 smiled using my face. After seeing the figure inside Corridor 9, the archive stopped feeling like a government facility and started feeling like something alive beneath the mountain. The change happened gradually through details subtle enough to rationalize individually but impossible to ignore together. The surveillance systems began displaying impossible footage during storms. Corridors appeared longer on camera than they physically existed underground. Archive doors leading to rooms that no longer matched their floor plans. Once, I watched a maintenance hallway on sublevel continue extending deeper into darkness for nearly 30 seconds on a live security feed before abruptly snapping back to normal dimensions again. Every incident occurred during thunderstorms above ground. Every distortion centered around sublevel C. And always, somewhere behind the archive noise and ventilation hum surrounding the facility, I could hear distant footsteps moving through sealed corridors beneath Corridor 9 after midnight. The intercom systems became more active almost immediately after the blast door incident. Some nights, disconnected speakers crackled softly with voices belonging to archive employees no longer working there. Other nights, the transmissions sounded deeply personal. My ex-wife asked whether I finally understood what emotional isolation felt like from the inside. My former military supervisor is repeating disciplinary statements from the investigation that ended my career years earlier. Once, I heard my own voice calmly reciting patrol routes through the ventilation speakers while I stood alone at the checkpoint desk listening. The voices themselves weren't what disturbed me most. It was how accurate they became over time. The more emotionally I reacted, even silently, the more natural the transmissions sounded afterward. By the end of the week, some conversations felt indistinguishable from real people speaking quietly somewhere nearby inside the archive itself. Then the floor layouts started changing. Not dramatically. Subtly. A maintenance corridor longer than I remembered from the night before. Archive doors appearing along hallways where blank concrete walls used to exist. Stairwells connecting to different sublevels than the maps indicated during storms. At first, I blamed exhaustion from the overnight rotations underground. Identical architecture disorients people easily without natural light or external reference points. But eventually the inconsistencies became impossible to dismiss. One night, I followed my normal patrol route through sublevel C only to discover checkpoint 4 positioned nearly 50 feet farther down the corridor than it should have been. Another shift, I spent almost 20 minutes trying to locate an elevator that surveillance footage later proved had never moved from its original location at all. The archive itself seemed to reorganize gradually during the storm, as the underground facility couldn't fully maintain a consistent physical structure after midnight. The worst incident happened during another thunderstorm, roughly a week after the blast door partially opened. Around 1:14 a.m., every surveillance camera on sublevel C lost signal simultaneously except for the feed inside Corridor 9. The restricted hallway appeared fully illuminated beneath flickering emergency lights despite the blast door officially remaining sealed under lockdown status. At first, the corridor looked empty. Then the camera angle shifted slowly downward toward the polished concrete floor. Reflections moved across the surface before any figures entered the frame. Human reflections walking calmly through the corridor, several seconds ahead of invisible bodies above them. One by one, the figures themselves appeared afterward, following the same paths their reflections had already traveled moments earlier. Some wore archive staff uniforms from different decades. Others looked like security personnel. And standing nearest the camera beneath the emergency lights was another version of me wearing the same overnight uniform I currently had on inside the checkpoint office. Then the emergency lockdown siren activated throughout the archive. Not briefly this time. Continuous. Deep mechanical alarms echoed through the underground corridors hard enough to vibrate the concrete walls surrounding sublevel C. The blast doors across the archive slammed shut automatically, one after another, while red emergency lights flooded the hallways outside the checkpoint station. Then the intercom beside my desk crackled softly through the sirens. "Officer Hale," Evelyn whispered calmly through the static. "The archive changes faster once it recognizes your layout." Before I could respond, every security monitor inside the checkpoint office flickered simultaneously. The camera feeds vanished completely except for one final image appearing across all the screens at once. Corridor 9. Blast door fully open now. Endless darkness stretches deeper underground beyond the archive wing. And somewhere far inside that darkness, hidden beneath the emergency lights and static distortion, I could see dozens of people standing motionless in the tunnels below the mountain, using faces I recognized from my own memories. After the lockdown incident, I stopped treating the archive disturbances like system malfunctions or psychological stress. Hallways don't physically rearrange themselves because someone is tired. Reflections don't move independently through security footage during storms. And the faces standing beyond Corridor 9 weren't random hallucinations pulled from abstract fear. I recognized them personally. My ex-wife. Former supervisors. A detainee killed during the courthouse evacuation years earlier, whose expression still appeared in my dreams sometimes when I slept badly enough. Whatever existed beneath the archive wasn't generating generic terror. It was building environments using emotional recognition in the same way the intercom voices learned personal memories over time. That realization disturbed me more than anything else because it implied intent. Something under the mountain understood human perception well enough to reorganize reality around it gradually. The next morning, I started digging through old archive incident reports more aggressively than before. Most of the deeper historical files remained classified beyond my clearance level, but enough fragmented records existed inside maintenance databases and forgotten security logs to piece together a rough timeline. The underground archive wasn't originally built as a storage facility. During the late 1950s, the government used the mountain beneath the station for experimental subterranean infrastructure projects connected to Cold War continuity programs. Officially, the lower excavation tunnels were abandoned after repeated structural instability made expansion unsafe. Unofficially, the records described workers becoming disoriented underground during storms long before the archive levels existed above the original tunnels. Several engineers disappeared inside the excavation sectors after reporting spatial inconsistencies beneath the mountain during heavy electrical activity. One declassified memo described entire hallways appearing in locations not present on architectural blueprints. Then I found Evelyn Ross's personal research files hidden behind loose panels inside the checkpoint office wall. Most of the documents focused on atmospheric pressure readings and electromagnetic fluctuations during thunderstorms over the archive. But the latter notes became increasingly obsessive. Evelyn believed the mountain itself contained naturally occurring geological structures capable of interfering with human spatial perception under specific environmental conditions. According to her research, Electrical storms amplified the effect dramatically. Entire sections of the lower tunnels began displaying impossible architecture during atmospheric events. Corridors extending beyond map dimensions, doors leading to inconsistent locations, and reflections appearing seconds before physical movement occurred. One sentence repeated throughout nearly every page: "The archive does not create copies. It reorganizes recognition." According to Evelyn, the phenomenon beneath the mountain learned human identities through prolonged exposure until eventually the archive itself stopped distinguishing between original memory and reconstructed perception. The deeper I read, the worse the records became. Security logs dating back decades described personnel encountering identical versions of themselves inside restricted hallways during storms. Several workers reported hearing conversations before physically entering the rooms where they later occurred. Others described becoming trapped inside archive sectors that no longer matched the facility layout once thunderstorms passed overhead. Then I found the final report connected to Evelyn's disappearance 7 years earlier. Officially, she vanished during a containment breach caused by severe electrical failures across sublevel C. But buried beneath the incident summary was a sealed observation transcript from another security officer stationed nearby that night. According to the witness statement, Evelyn continued communicating through the archive intercom system for nearly 40 minutes after surveillance footage showed her entering Corridor 9 alone. Her final transmission reportedly contained only one sentence repeated over and over through heavy static: "The hallways are learning us faster than we're learning them." That night, the archive changed completely. The storm above the mountain started shortly after midnight. Thunder rolled through the ventilation shafts while emergency lighting flickered softly across sublevel C long before any official lockdown was activated. Around 1:06 a.m., I noticed something impossible on the surveillance monitors. Every corridor camera inside the archive displayed movement roughly 2 seconds before it physically occurred in real time. Reflections crossing hallway floors before personnel entered the frame. Elevator doors opened moments before the control systems activated. Then the checkpoint intercom crackled softly beside me. "Nathan," Evelyn whispered through static. Perfectly calm. "The archive knows you understand it now." Before I could answer, every monitor inside the checkpoint office shifted simultaneously to Corridor 9. The blast door stood open again beneath flickering emergency lights. But this time the tunnel beyond wasn't empty. Dozens of people stood motionless inside the darkness, watching the checkpoint cameras from deep underground. And standing closest to the entrance was another version of me wearing my security uniform. Same posture. Same exhausted expression. Except that his reflection on the polished tunnel floor was already walking slowly toward the checkpoint several seconds ahead of him. Seeing my reflection move before the body attached to it changed something fundamental inside me. Up until then, I could still force parts of what was happening underground into explanations involving electromagnetic interference, psychological manipulation, or some classified government experiment gone wrong beneath the mountain. But reflections do not predict human movement. Hallways do not anticipate conversations before they happen. The archive wasn't malfunctioning anymore. It was adapting. Evelyn's notes suddenly made horrifying sense in ways they hadn't before. The facility beneath the mountain didn't create hallucinations exactly. It reorganized recognition itself until human perception stopped distinguishing between memory, reflection, and physical reality. That's why the intercom voices became more accurate over time. Why did the corridors change shape gradually instead of suddenly? The archive learned identities through observation until eventually it could construct convincing versions of people from accumulated recognition patterns alone. I stopped sleeping properly after that night. Most mornings, I sat alone inside the checkpoint office staring at the surveillance monitors while thunder rolled faintly through the mountain above, trying to convince myself to resign and leave the archive permanently before the next storm arrived. But leaving no longer felt simple. Evelyn's research files repeatedly warned that prolonged exposure created residual recognition effects even outside the facility itself. Former personnel reported spatial inconsistencies weeks after reassignment, reflections lagging behind movement, familiar hallways appearing subtly rearranged, conversations repeating before they occurred. One security contractor supposedly walked into traffic after claiming that city streets no longer matched their remembered layouts properly. Whether the stories were true stopped mattering eventually. I believed them anyway. So instead of running, I started studying the archive patterns the same way Evelyn apparently had before disappearing underground. I created my own rules after that. Never trust reflections during storms. Never follow corridors if the lighting sequence activates ahead of your movement instead of responding to it naturally. Never answer intercom transmissions using personal names. Most importantly, never allow yourself to emotionally engage with the copies underground, regardless of who they resemble. For a while, the archive actually seemed calmer afterward. Fewer intercom transmissions. Fewer surveillance distortions. Some nights, the underground levels almost felt normal again beneath the humming fluorescent lights and endless concrete corridors surrounding the checkpoint stations. But the facility adapted quickly once I stopped reacting emotionally the way it expected. Instead of using familiar voices, the archive started altering physical space more aggressively around me. Entire patrol routes are extended longer than mathematically possible during storms. Doors opened into archive sectors that didn't exist on any blueprint. Once, I spent nearly 30 minutes walking toward an elevator that never appeared despite remaining visible at the far end of the hallway the entire time. Then the reflections started appearing outside reflective surfaces entirely. The first time happened during a patrol through sublevel B around 12:50 a.m. during another thunderstorm. I turned a corner near the restricted storage vaults and briefly saw myself standing motionless at the opposite end of the corridor before the lights flickered overhead. Not a mirror. Not a reflection. Another Nathan Hale is watching me silently beneath the fluorescent lights. When the power stabilized seconds later, the hallway stood empty again except for wet footprints leading toward the lower archive stairwell. After that, the sightings became more frequent. Sometimes, I caught glimpses of myself standing behind the checkpoint glass moments before entering the room physically. Other nights, the security cameras showed another version of me continuing patrol routes several minutes after I had already returned to the checkpoint office upstairs. The worst incidents happened during full lockdowns when the archive sealed entire wings automatically beneath emergency lighting. That's when the intercom systems sounded closest to the surface. Not threatening. Conversational. Like dozens of familiar people talking softly through the walls around me from slightly different versions of the same corridor. 3 nights later, I discovered the final section of Evelyn's research hidden inside a maintenance crawlspace beneath Corridor 9 itself. The pages looked rushed, almost frantic, covered in hand-drawn maps of hallways rearranging themselves during storms. "The archive isn't underground," one sentence read repeatedly across several pages. "We are." Another line appeared beneath it, hard enough to tear through the paper. Recognition creates architecture. According to Evelyn's final notes, the mountain beneath the facility contained naturally occurring geological formations that distorted spatial memory during electromagnetic activity. Over decades, the archive unknowingly amplified the phenomenon through surveillance systems, underground isolation, and endless repeated observation of classified human records. Eventually, the facility itself became capable of reconstructing identities through accumulated recognition patterns. The deeper someone is emotionally connected to the archive distortions, the more stable their duplicate becomes underground afterward. I barely finished reading the final page before the storm sirens activated throughout the facility. Every hallway light shifted to emergency red simultaneously. And on the surveillance monitor mounted beside the crawlspace entrance, Corridor 9 had already opened by itself again. The emergency lockdown sirens echoed through the archive hard enough to vibrate the concrete walls around Corridor 9, while every surveillance monitor across sublevel C dissolved into static simultaneously. Red emergency lights flooded the underground hallways beneath the mountain, transforming the archive into something deeper and older than a government facility. Somewhere above us, thunder rolled directly across the ridge overhead while electrical interference rippled visibly through the fluorescent lighting systems surrounding the checkpoint corridors. Then the intercom activated beside the crawlspace entrance. "Nathan," Evelyn whispered through static. "The archive is reorganizing around you now." My stomach tightened instantly because her tone no longer sounded frightened. It sounded resigned. Like someone explaining a process already too far along to stop completely. Then the blast door to Corridor 9 groaned fully open somewhere down the hall. Cold air rushed through sublevel C immediately afterward. Not ventilation air. Outside air. Wet concrete. Rainwater. Ozone. Impossible smells for a facility buried hundreds of feet underground beneath solid mountain stone. I stepped back into the main corridor just as the lighting sequence changed around me again. The archive hallways no longer resembled their original layout properly. Corridors stretched farther than they physically should have been, while intersections appeared where blank walls had existed hours earlier. Entire sections of the facility looked older now. Rusted pipes exposed beneath cracked concrete ceilings, abandoned security checkpoints half swallowed by darkness beyond the emergency lights. The architecture felt layered somehow, like multiple versions of the archive occupying the same underground space imperfectly during the storm. And standing throughout those hallways beneath the flickering red lights were people. Dozens of them. Silent figures watching the corridors calmly from impossible distances underground, using faces pulled directly from my memory. Then I saw myself again. Not on a monitor. Not reflected. Standing physically at the far end of Corridor 9 beneath the emergency lighting. Same security uniform. Same posture. Same exhaustion carved into the face from too many sleepless nights underground. Except this version of me looked calmer somehow. More complete. The duplicate raised one hand slowly toward the corridor beside him while the archive around us groaned softly beneath the mountain. "You still think you're the original because you remember suffering more clearly," he said in my voice. "But recognition works both directions now." Behind him, the corridor beyond 9 no longer resembled archive tunnels at all. Instead, endless hallways stretched underground beneath flickering fluorescent lights that repeated infinitely into darkness. Some sections looked like old military bunkers. Others resembled office buildings, hospitals, apartment hallways from different decades layered together impossibly beneath the mountain. And moving slowly through all of them were reflections wearing human faces slightly out of sync with the memories they came from. The intercom systems were activated throughout the archive simultaneously. Hundreds of voices speaking softly through the walls around me. My ex-wife asked why I always disconnected emotionally before people left. Former supervisors' rare, epiating disciplinary reports. My own voice calmly describing patrol routes that hadn't happened yet. Beneath all of them, another sound emerged gradually through the static. Footsteps. Thousands of them were moving slowly through the impossible corridors beyond Corridor 9 towards sublevel C. Then the duplicate stepped closer into the emergency light. "The archive only copies unstable recognition," he whispered calmly. "That's why it chose you." The sentence hit harder than it should have because part of me already understood the truth inside it. Years of emotional isolation, disconnection, guilt. I'd spent so long feeling detached from my own life that the archive probably found me easier to reconstruct than someone emotionally grounded in themselves properly. Maybe that's why the hallways adapted around me faster than the others before. Then the walls started moving. Not metaphorically, physically. The concrete corridors surrounding sublevel C shifted with deep grinding sounds beneath the mountain while emergency lights flickered violently overhead. Hallways extended. Doors disappeared. Entire sections of the archive folded inward like rearranging architecture inside a living organism. The checkpoint office behind me stretched impossibly deeper underground, while surveillance monitors displayed corridors that no longer existed physically anywhere inside the facility. And reflected across every polished surface surrounding the emergency lights, glass, concrete, security screens, I could already see my own reflection reacting slightly before I moved now. Just enough delay to understand something horrifying. The archive no longer distinguished between the original Nathan Hale and the version standing inside Corridor 9 anymore. And somewhere far below the mountain, beneath the shifting hallways around us, I could hear the rest of the archive learning how to open completely. For several seconds, I couldn't move. The archive around me groaned beneath the mountain while corridors physically rearranged themselves through the emergency lighting, concrete walls sliding slowly against each other with deep mechanical sounds that felt far too organic to belong to architecture alone. The duplicate standing inside Corridor 9 kept watching me calmly while endless hallways shifted behind him beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Then he smiled slightly, using my face. "You still think this place is underground?" he whispered in my ear. "That's why you keep trying to escape it physically." Behind him, the impossible corridors stretching beyond 9 continued expanding into darkness while reflections crossed the polished floors several seconds before bodies appeared above them. Some of the figures walking there used faces I recognized personally. Others looked unfinished somehow, human expressions reconstructed from partial memories and incomplete emotional patterns. That was the moment I finally understood what the archive actually was. The government never built the facility to store information. It discovered a place that already stored recognition naturally. Somewhere beneath the mountain, the geological formations Evelyn studied interacted with human observation the same way magnetic tape records sound. Decades of surveillance systems, classified records, emotional interrogation reports, and isolated underground staffing gradually taught the archive how to reconstruct identity through repeated recognition exposure. The storms amplified the effect because electrical activity destabilized the separation between memory and physical perception underground. That's why reflections moved first. Reflections already exist as imperfect copies naturally. The archive simply learned how to stabilize them through observation until eventually the copies no longer required reflective surfaces to maintain structure. And standing there beneath the emergency lights watching another version of myself breathe calmly inside Corridor 9, I realized something horrifying. The duplicate genuinely believed he was the original Nathan Hale, too. Then I noticed the emergency demolition controls mounted beside the old maintenance junction near sublevel C. Most federal continuity facilities contain structural collapse protocols buried deep inside their infrastructure in case classified sectors require permanent sealing during catastrophic breaches. According to the faded warning labels beside the control panel, activating the system would collapse the abandoned excavation tunnels beneath Corridor 9 permanently under several thousand tons of reinforced concrete and mountain rock. The duplicate followed my gaze immediately. For the first time since appearing physically in the archive, his expression changed slightly. Not fear. Concern. "If you collapse the lower sectors," he said quietly, "the archive won't disappear. It'll lose its structure." Behind him, The impossible hallways beyond Corridor 9 shifted violently beneath the storm while distant figures moved endlessly through the underground maze below. Right now it's contained to the mountain because the archive gives recognition boundaries, he continued calmly. Destroy the architecture, and the copies won't know where they stop anymore. The footsteps beneath the archive kept getting closer. Thousands now. Moving through endless reconstructed hallways beneath the mountain towards sublevel C. The intercom voices surrounding the corridor had stopped sounding human entirely. Conversations overlapped too quickly now, fragments of memories and identities bleeding together through the walls around the facility while reflections crossed polished surfaces independently from the people standing near them. I stared at the demolition controls while thunder rolled directly overhead through the ventilation shafts above us. Maybe the duplicate was telling the truth. Maybe collapsing the archive would spread whatever existed beneath the mountain instead of containing it. But another realization settled quietly into place while the corridors continued shifting around us. The archive only learned identities through repeated recognition exposure. It needed observation, structure, stable patterns. And the longer the underground facility existed, the more complete the copies became afterward. I activated the demolition sequence anyway. The effect on the archive was immediate. Deep below the mountain, massive charges detonated through the abandoned excavation sectors beneath Corridor 9 hard enough to throw me against the checkpoint wall instantly. The underground corridors surrounding sublevel C screamed with tearing concrete and collapsing steel while emergency lights burst overhead in showers of sparks. The impossible hallways beyond Corridor 9 folded inward violently beneath clouds of dust and darkness as entire sections of reconstructed architecture collapsed into the mountain below. And for the first time since encountering the duplicate underground, genuine fear crossed his face. Not anger. Not hatred. Panic. Like something realizing the boundaries keeping it stable were disappearing too fast to adapt properly. Then the reflections surrounding us shattered simultaneously across every polished surface in the archive. Thousands of fractured versions of human faces breaking apart through the collapsing corridors while the mountain itself groaned beneath the facility like something enormous shifting awake underground after decades of observation. I barely escaped the archive before the lower sectors collapsed completely beneath the mountain. The demolition charges tore through the abandoned excavation tunnels under Corridor 9 hard enough to destabilize half the underground facility within minutes. Concrete walls split apart throughout sublevel C while emergency lighting failed section by section behind me. I remember running through corridors that no longer obeyed consistent geometry while dust and sparks filled the ventilation shafts overhead. Some hallways stretched impossibly long before folding inward beneath collapsing ceilings moments later. Others simply ended where rooms used to exist, replaced by solid concrete or endless darkness descending deeper underground than the archive blueprints ever showed. Then came the sound from beneath the mountain itself. Not explosions. Something larger. A low-layered groan vibrating upward through the collapsing facility, like the archive beneath us was still trying to reorganize itself while the structure holding it together died around it. By the time I reached the surface elevator, the entire mountain was shaking beneath the storm overhead. Rain hammered the abandoned weather station above ground while emergency sirens screamed through the forest surrounding the facility entrance. Behind me, deep inside the collapsing archive, I could still hear voices echoing faintly through the ventilation shafts even after the underground power systems failed completely. Familiar voices. My own among them. Calmly repeating patrol routes that no longer existed through hallways buried under tons of rock and concrete. Then the mountain partially collapsed inward behind the station. Trees shook violently along the ridge while sections of the access road cracked open beneath the rainstorm. The facility entrance sealed automatically seconds later beneath emergency blast shutters as the lower archive disappeared beneath the mountain permanently. At least physically. Officially, The government classified the incident as a catastrophic structural failure caused by aging subterranean infrastructure destabilized during severe weather conditions. That explanation satisfied most people because continuity facilities buried underground fail constantly once maintenance budgets disappear long enough. Nobody questioned why federal crews demolished the remaining surface buildings weeks afterward. Nobody asked why entire sections of the surrounding forest remained fenced off permanently after the collapse. The investigators mostly focused on whether stress and exhaustion affected my perception during the evacuation. I let them believe that version because certain truths stop sounding more believable the more accurately you explain them. Still, one detail unsettled even the federal engineers overseeing the cleanup. During seismic scans after the collapse, motion sensors continued detecting shifting architectural patterns beneath the mountain despite every known underground structure being destroyed. I left Virginia after that and never worked security again. For a while, I convinced myself that collapsing the archive ended whatever had been happening beneath the mountain permanently. Trauma eventually becomes easier to package into manageable explanations once enough distance exists between you and the place where it happened. But some things refuse to fit into rational categories afterward. About 4 months after the collapse, I received an encrypted government hard drive with no return address containing only one surviving archive camera file recovered before the facility sealed itself underground. Against every instinct telling me not to watch it, I opened the footage late one night inside my apartment. The recording showed Corridor 9 moments before the demolition charges activated beneath the archive. Emergency lights flickered across the hallway while dust drifted slowly through the air around the checkpoint station. And standing inside the corridor, watching the camera calmly, was the duplicate wearing my face. Same uniform. Same exhausted posture. Same expression I see in mirrors now when I wake up too quickly after dreams about underground hallways. Then, just before the footage ended, the duplicate looked directly into the camera and spoke one final sentence in my voice. "You only buried the architecture. I barely sleep now." Most nights, I wake around 1:14 a.m., convinced my apartment layout feels slightly different from the night before. Hallways longer than I remember. Furniture is positioned inches away from where it should be. Sometimes reflections in dark windows react a moment too early before I move. Other nights, I hear distant intercom static inside an empty room, followed by voices speaking softly through walls that shouldn't contain wiring anymore. But the worst moments happen during storms. Heavy thunderstorms, especially. That's when familiar places start feeling subtly incorrect around me. Grocery stores. Parking garages. Hotel corridors. Every once in a while, for less than a second, I'll turn a corner and glimpse another version of myself standing farther down the hallway watching calmly before disappearing when the lights flicker overhead. And during those moments, I always remember the final line from Evelyn Ross's research notes hidden beneath Corridor 9. The archive never copied people. It taught reality how to rearrange them.